Let's go to the next lesson, selectors. Type of selectors. Remember that declarations are a fundamental part of CSS because they apply a style to a selected element. But how do you decide which element will get the style? You use a selector. So here's an example of selector. They're going to change the color to green of all P elements. Universal. The universal selector uses the star character in the same place where you specify the type selector in a rule set like so. So if you use the universal selector, here in the example you have border, one pick, solid, red, it's going to be applied to the whole page. Class. CSS is not limited to selecting elements by their type. As you know, HTML elements can also have attributes. When working with HTML and CSS, a class attribute is one of the most common ways to select an element. For example, consider the following. Paragraph, class, brand. The paragraph element in the example above has a class attribute within the opening tag of the P element. The class attribute is set to brand to select the element using CSS. We can create a rule set with a class selector dot brand. So here's universal element, a class. And to select a class, you're going to use dot and then the class. Multiple classes. We can use CSS to select HTML's element class attribute by name. And so far we have select elements using only one class name per element. And every HTML element has a single class. All the style information for each element would require a new class. Luckily, it's possible to add more than one class name to an HTML element's class attribute. For instance, perhaps there's heading elements that needs to be green and bold. You could write choose CSS rule set green and bold. Then you can include both of these classes on the HTML element h1 class green bold. ID. In contrast to class, which accepts multiple values and can be used broadly throughout an HTML document, an element's ID can only have a single value and only be used once per page. And in order to select an ID, you're going to use hashtag. Attribute. You may remember that some HTML elements use attributes to add extra detail or functionality to the element. Some familiar attributes may be href or source, but there are many more, including class and ID. The attribute selector can be used to target HTML elements that already contain attributes. Elements of the same type can be targeted differently by their attribute or attribute value. This alleviates the need to add new code, like the class or ID attributes. Attributes can be selected similarly to types, classes, and IDs. The syntax to call an attribute. Pseudo-class. You may have observed how the appearance of certain elements can change or be in a different state after certain user interactions. For instance, when you click on an input element and a blue border is added showing that it is in focus. When you click on a blue anchor link to visit to another page, but when you return the link's text is purple. When you're filling out a form and the form button is grayed out and disabled, but when all of the fields have been filled out and buttons color showing that it is active. These are examples of pseudo-class selectors in action. In fact, focus, visitor, disable, and active are pseudo-classes. Factors such as user interaction, site navigation, and position the document tree can all give elements a different state with pseudo-class. A pseudo-class can be attached to any selector, and it is always written as a column, followed by the name, for example, p hover. Classes and IDs. CSS can select HTML elements by the type, class, and ID. CSS classes and IDs have different purposes, which can affect which one you use to style HTML elements. CSS classes are meant to be reused over many elements. By writing CSS classes, you can style elements in a variety of ways by mixing classes. For instance, imagine a page with two headlines. One headline needs to be bold and blue, and the other needs to be bold and green. Instead of writing separate CSS rules for each headline that repeat each other's code, it's better to write a dot bold CSS rule, a dark green CSS rule, and a dark blue CSS rule. Then you can give one headline the bold green classes and the other the bold blue classes. While classes are meant to be used many times, an ID is meant to style only one element. Specificity is the order by which the browser decides which CSS style will be displayed. A best practice in CSS is to style elements while using the lowest degree of specificity so that if an element needs a new style, it is easier to overwrite. IDs are the most specific selector in CSS, followed by classes, and finally type. For example, in the example above, the color of the heading would be set to Firebrick, as the class selector is more specific than the type selector. Chaining. When writing CSS rules, it is possible to require an HTML element to have two or more CSS selectors at the same time. This is done by combining multiple selectors, which we will refer to as chaining. For example, if there was a special class for h1 elements, the CSS would look like below: h1 and then dot special. Decent combinator. In addition to chaining selectors to select elements, CSS also supports selecting elements that are nested within the other HTML elements, also known as descendants. For instance, consider the following HTML. In an ordered list, the nested list elements are descendant of the UL element, and it can be selected with a descendant combinator like so. Dot main list, so they just call the class, dot main list li. Chaining and specificity. In the last exercise, instead of selecting all h5 elements, you selected only the h5 elements nested inside the dot description elements. This CSS selector was more specific than writing only h5. Adding more than one tag class or ID to a CSS selector increases the specificity of the CSS selector. For instance, consider the following CSS. Both of these CSS rules defines what a P element should look like. Since .main P has a class and a P type as its selector, only the P elements inside the .main element will appear red, despite there being another more general rule that states P elements should be blue. And finally, multiple selectors. In order to make CSS more concise, it's possible to add CSS style to multiple CSS selector all at once. This prevents writing repetitive code. So instead of doing h1 font family Georgia and dot menu font family Georgia, you can write h1 comma dot menu and just write the font one time.